So we're moving into chapter 22, budgeting, forecasting, and indeed control. One key point here that's relevant that will affect you, certainly within the SBL exam in my experience, the degree of a requirement for number crunching and a real in-depth knowledge of the sort of number crunching or financial areas, e.g. budgeting, etc., is not needed. I think what we need is a sort of an overview of the main areas, in particular, obviously, the difference between sort of conventional or standard traditional techniques and maybe, more contemporary technique solutions. So as a good example, beyond budgeting, versus, let's say, traditional style budgeting. Okay, so let's kick off then in terms of a little bit of background. So first section here, cost control systems. Now, we know how important cost efficiencies and controlling costs are for businesses. And indeed, this has been relevant for many, many years. Cost control has been around since accounting has been around. So in essence, things like, budgeting or standard budgeting, or if you will, traditional budgeting, a la sort of a fixed budget for a period, a comparison of that budget to actuals, a nod to variances, investigation, etc. This has been around as long as broadly business has been around. Linked into that, the idea of a standard cost or standard costing, and indeed, as just mentioned, variance analysis, along with obviously marginal and indeed absorption costing. So, the origins go back some way. And indeed, as I've just said, one of the key points to recognize is that the business environment, and indeed business broadly speaking, has changed over time. So we maybe need to come up with techniques that are more relevant to today and today's sort of modern business environment. Okay? Next area for us is just really looking at how the business environment has changed. Certainly if we compare the environment today to even 20, 30 years ago, it's completely different. So what are the sort of factors that have been involved? Well, certainly globalization. There is so much more competition now because the world has got smaller. I mean, that's distribution channels, transport, media, social media, etc., etc., etc. That's the first thing. The second thing is more and more recently, certainly, there's an emphasis on quality. There are so many competitors in different industries, and quality varies. People are much, much more interested in quality now than they would have been. One of the reasons for that, and indeed linked to the area of globalization, is changes in technology. Clearly, technology has had a massive impact on many, many businesses. We only have to look at the last 10 to 20 years and to see the degree of disruption within different industries. Industries are completely different now, at least some of them, to what they were even 10 to 15 years ago. So that's what's changing in the environment. So maybe our approach to cost control or indeed budgeting needs to change too. Next area for us is, well, given what we've just said, is cost control of less importance? Well, no, not really. We can see in the business environment that certainly, traditional cost control systems are still in play. Absorption costing, marginal costing, etc. But certainly on top of that, we see other techniques slowly being introduced, life cycle costing. In other words, the idea that over the course of a product's sort of development or creation, indeed through to sort of perhaps introduction, growth, maturity, costs are incurred in a variety of different ways over the life cycle of the product. And we need to analyze those costs. Target costing, simply the idea that rather than looking from the ground up in terms of costing, we actually look at perhaps, the sales price, and devise our margin or our preferred margin, and really look to sort of bridge the gap between sort of actual costs and indeed our target cost. So really, these sorts of techniques sort of add on to what we already know as traditional costing systems. And indeed, outside of that, and linked into the point above, about technology, certainly, more complex systems do lead to better ways to control costs and indeed to analyze costs. I mean, think about things like big data or data analytics, for an example, or indeed compare, let's say, modern accounting or integrated accounting systems to integrated accounting systems from 30, 40 years ago. Completely different. So cost control certainly is very, very important and indeed will remain important. Next area for us is the idea of, given traditional models, whatever they are, absorption costing, standard budgeting techniques, standard cost, variance analysis, what other sort of alternatives are there in terms of, a budgeting technique? Well, firstly, let's look at sort of the idea of linking to strategy, because at the end of the day, businesses, whatever costing method they use, must align their overall approach to cost control, budgeting, variance analysis to their strategies. So first things first, in terms of the mission, we know that, I guess the mission is the starting point, isn't it, for most businesses? If we were to start a business, we would want to establish what our purpose is. And everything stems from the mission. Really, it's our overall direction. And that is unlikely to change, certainly in the short term. Linked into that are the strategic objectives and indeed also the plans. So these are the areas that allow us, to put our mission into play. Okay? And indeed, in terms of plans, let's be clear here. What we're saying is that once we've established our overall corporate objectives, these are the sort of action steps, or if you will, courses of action, that will enable us to achieve our overall objectives. Now, drilling down a little bit further, really what we have is our budgets. So in essence, what you see here is a sort of a hierarchy. Yeah, so budgeting is clearly important. It's right at the end, but it will be driven from these points, from the mission, indeed vision, goals and objectives, and indeed plans, tactical and otherwise. Now, in terms of the benefits of budgeting, they really haven't changed. Budgeting provides a series of benefits. Budgeting is, in essence, forecasting. We're trying to forecast over the course of time the costs that we will incur. And indeed, on that basis, clearly, budgeting requires estimates and guesstimates. So it certainly promotes the idea that we need to plan and indeed look forward. Okay? The second key point is that clearly, businesses have interlinked functions and indeed departments. And what budgeting will enable us to do is sort of coordinate between these various departments. So for example, the actions of the marketing department will certainly affect the finance department. The action of the sales department will be affected by the marketing department. So budgeting encourages that. Linked into that, clearly, if we're looking at, in effect, sort of targets or areas of performance in terms of cost expenditure, clearly achieving those targets, as it were, or being on budget over the course of the next month, quarter, 6 months, etc., can provide a motivational tool for managers, something to aim towards, something to head towards. So really, broadly speaking, and we're generalizing, of course, budgeting can promote sort of broadly better performance. The key thing to remember, though, outside of what we just said, is that certainly budgeting is a difficult exercise, whatever technique or tool we use. There's a famous quote by J.K. Galbraith, the eminent economist in the 20th century who said words to the effect of, there are two types of forecaster, those that don't know and those that don't know they don't know. So despite these benefits, budgeting isn't straightforward. It isn't easy. And as I've said, maybe we need to come up with ways to sort of tweak the traditional approach that we've been using for some time. Now, let's look at sort of, I guess, what you might call a fairly traditional approach to budgeting, and that is sort of top down. And indeed, you could also mention, I guess, the reverse of that, sort of bottom up. So what do we mean by top down? Well, in essence, central preparation. We're talking about a budget being decided upon, a budget being formulated by senior management. There is, in a top-down fashion, no involvement in either middle level or indeed lower level management. Budgets are simply, if you will, imposed upon the organization based on the decisions and estimations by senior management. Now, if you think about it, that approach is, in one sense, good because it's going to be fairly quick. Senior management are skilled, they're experts, they know the business, and in fact, we're going to cut down on the amount of time because fewer people are going to be involved. The flip side, though, is obviously you have no knowledge from people that are at the coalface. We do not have middle management and indeed lower management involved in the process. That could create some resentment. In effect, to use the word that I use, imposed. Budgets under this method are simply sent down the chain. This is your budget, get on with that. Now that can lead to demotivation. The budgets may be difficult to achieve. It could lead to dysfunctional behavior, people trying to cut corners in order to meet their budget. So there's one approach. You might call that a pretty straightforward, traditional style approach. Flip side of that, I guess, is bottom up. So this is where, obviously, managers prepare their own budgets. Note, initially, okay? Now, when I say initially, what I mean is that these budgets may well be reviewed by middle or senior management as well. They don't have to be, but they may well be. So in essence, you've got the reverse of up top. You've got managers who are, at the coalface. They are close to the action. They know what they're doing. And indeed, they have perhaps better information than senior management in relation to their jobs. And indeed, the possibility of different budgeted costs being higher or lower than anticipated. So getting managers involved in a sort of a bottom-up approach tends to have positives, absolutely. But it can also, like the above, it can have negatives. Because managers perhaps may feel that given the fact that they have this autonomy to create their own budgets, perhaps they may build in slack. Perhaps the idea of giving control to managers to decide, at least initially, on their own budget could lead to some form of dysfunctional behavior. So let's try and remember the words, okay? Top down, senior management down, bottom up, managers up, okay? Now, another sort of fairly sort of straightforward traditional style approach, I guess, is fixed budgets and indeed as an add-on, flexible budgets. Now, let's be clear on what we're talking about here. The only difference between a fixed budget and a flexible budget is levels of activity. So let's boil budgeting down in its simplest form. I'm running a business, I decide on a budget, and I anticipate that my volume of, let's say, production and sales is equal, and it will be 10,000 units. I basically go into action, I produce, I sell, and then over the course of the next month, excuse me, or next quarter, I do a variance exercise. I analyze the difference between my actual performance and indeed my anticipated level of activity, which was 10,000, let's say, per quarter. That is a fixed approach. Now, the issue with operating purely a fixed style budgeting technique, is that things change. I mean, clearly, the likelihood of us being exactly on target, 10,000, is pretty low. So what fixed budgeting doesn't do is it doesn't really flex for what's actually happening. And we have a budget set in stone, at a particular level, let's say, for argument's sake, for the next 12 months. And that may well be unrealistic. There may be areas in the environment that change. They may change dramatically. That does require us to adjust, perhaps increase volume, perhaps reduce volume. And this is where, I guess, flexibility comes in. Flexible budgets are really the idea, to put it in basic terms, that we flex the budget, based on levels of activity that we experience. In other words, we sort of suck and see, and we learn as we go. So in terms of sort of broadly speaking, a sort of advantages, certainly there'd be easier comparison, if we compare like with like. In other words, if we introduce a sort of a flexed approach, then certainly we'll be able to compare month on month, quarter on quarter, year on year more easily. In addition to that, by flexing, clearly we have better knowledge of cost behavior because we're using more recent, more up-to-date figures. What about disadvantages? Certainly, in today's modern world, when we look at, let's take manufacturing, certainly many processes today, as opposed to, let's say, 40, 50 years ago, many processes are automated rather than being linked to hands, linked to people, linked to labor. So in one sense, many costs or more costs now are fixed than variable. So what that means is, to some extent, we should have a better feel for volume because we should be able to anticipate costs because variable costs, marginal costs, are less in occurrence. Fixed costs are fixed and they account for a higher proportion of our budgeted costs than they would have done, let's say, 40, 50 years ago. The next key point is obviously the difficulty in identifying, variable versus fixed costs over time. And that creates a problem in terms of producing, accurate, useful, flexible budgets because it's difficult to know where the demarcation line is. Next area for us, still on the sort of theme of, how do we solve this problem of broadly traditional budgeting and it being slightly antiquated, maybe out of date. Maybe we need to think of different ideas in terms of producing budgets, is this area of rolling budgets. Now, we see this as a popular exam topic, not least in SBL, but also in other exams, and for good reason. What do we mean by a rolling budget? Well, we're talking about, rather than having a fixed budget, so this is my budget for the next 12 months. It's 40,000 units, 100,000 units. It's fixed in stone, and I'll simply, each quarter, each period, I'll do my variance analysis. What we do with a rolling style budget is we continually update it based on the last period. In other words, we adjust forward. So linked into that, in terms of the horizon, in other words, the time period, we always keep it constant by adding another quarter to the end of the period. So in essence, we start with a 12-month period. We run through quarter one, let's say January, February, March. And indeed, given what's happened in actual terms within quarter one, January, February, March, we update the budget. We update the budget for what has happened, and we add another 3 months on based on the knowledge that we've gained about that 3-month period. So in essence, what you have is a continuously updated budget that is probably going to be more accurate because you're constantly making adjustments for what has happened in the last 3 months or the last period. So what would be the main advantages of using that sort of approach? Well, certainly rather than having a budget that in terms of time horizons is simply sort of getting less and less and less, we always have a budget, and indeed that budget is always based on what's happened more recently, particularly in the last 12 months. Next one is motivation. Well, certainly you can see that if budgets are being based on what's actually happening, as opposed to, say, being imposed by top management for the next 12 months, then certainly that may lend to, maybe not always, but it may lend to better motivated workforce, because managers can see, well, at least we know that what is actually happening is affecting the budgets that we're having to adhere towards. In terms of disadvantages, well, there's several. The first one clearly is the idea that the budgeting process becomes more convoluted. There's much more work to do. You have to not only do what you would have ordinarily done, i.e. compare actual to budget, but you also have to adjust. You have to adjust forward and indeed build in and the next quarter. Remember that we always keep 12 months ahead. Another interesting point here is, in essence, if we don't have an environment that's extremely dynamic, in other words, that, costs are changing willy-nilly on a daily, weekly basis, and indeed we're invariably sort of outside our budget, either above or below, then it may well be that rolling budgets aren't really required. If it's stable, if it's pretty stable as an environment, then the idea of putting so much time and effort in order to be accurate or 100% accurate or honing our budgets really may not make a lot of sense in terms of the old cost v benefit argument. Okay? So there's rolling budgets, and again, just because there are some disadvantages, and does this make it less of an exam target? Certainly not. I'd definitely be familiar with what we mean, and there's not much to rolling budgets. We're talking about adding on another period, and indeed adjusting the budget based on that previous period. Okay, so that's rolling budgets. Next area for us is this idea of incremental budgeting. Now, if there ever was a sort of a very simple, old-style, traditional approach to budgeting, then certainly this is it. Because as we'll see from the sort of definition here, basically, incremental budgeting is just very simply starting with the last period, so the previous period's budget, and really just adding or subtracting incremental amounts for known changes. So literally, on a very simple basis, it might be as straightforward as saying, well, stationery costs were £10,000 last year, or $10,000. Let's just add 5% in for this year to allow for changes or some slight difference in prices from suppliers. That's it. So, if you think about it, this is a very, very simple way to do budgeting. We're simply looking at last year plus or minus X. So in terms of advantages, well, certainly easy and quick to do, because we just take last year and add some stuff on or take something away. But, incremental budgeting is often criticized because, in essence, without some time input in the preparation, all that you're doing is really coming up with a new number. And it may well be some inefficiencies or unnecessary costs because you really haven't done too much work in deciding on the numbers could remain. Okay? And indeed, linked into that, inefficiencies or indeed efficiencies, will not, or it's highly unlikely that they will be identified by simply using an incremental approach year on year or period on period. So in essence, incremental budgeting, very, very straightforward. Yes, we like it, easy to do. But in terms of reliability or maybe usefulness or dealing with improvements or dealing with inefficiencies, not overly helpful. What about the flip side? And if there ever was the sort of reverse of incremental budgeting, then certainly it is zero-based budgeting. Now, again, this is the sort of area I'd encourage you to be on top of. We see SBL style questions, and you see this in a lot of case study exams. Reference to new techniques, disruptive techniques, and this is one. So, what do we mean by zero-based budgeting? Well, it sort of does what it says in the tin. Requires managers to plan what projects they wish to undertake and base their budget on these. Now, we need a little bit more than that. That's the definition from the Study Hub. Really what zero-based budgeting means for managers is that at the budget preparation process time, really what managers are required to do is to start from a blank sheet. Literally, their budget across the board for all items starts at zero, and they have to justify everything from zero upwards. They have to justify every penny, every cent, every dollar, every euro, every pound. So in essence, you're talking about a budget that's nearly completely the reverse to an incremental budget, with an incremental budget obviously being last year plus X or minus X. ZBB starts at zero. Now, this creates a problem for managers, as we will see in a moment, and indeed, there's massive time input here. But there must be some advantages. Well, certainly, I would suggest that if a manager is required to literally justify every penny, every cent, every dollar, etc., then the idea that the budget may include slack is probably unlikely. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's more difficult for slack to be built in because everything has to be justified. In addition to that, it's certainly you would expect if justification is required for literally every single item of expenditure, it's probably more likely, if this isn't bulletproof, but it's probably more likely that resources are going to be used more effectively. Resources are going to be allocated to programs that best achieve the objectives of the organization because we are keeping things tighter. We're much more on point in relation to all of our budgeted expenditure. Now, disadvantages, certainly there are. As we see, the first one is the amount of time involved. The budget preparation process is going to be extremely time-consuming and indeed costly. This is, as mentioned up top, sort of the reverse of the incremental approach. We literally have to go from the ground up. So time and cost, massive issues. In addition to that, it would only be natural for managers involved in the budget holders, and indeed other staff or unions to feel threatened. Because in essence, what you're saying is you don't have a budget until you justify every single penny in every way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, this is a process that happens every time you come to prepare a budget. So this is a lot of work. And, the introduction of something like ZBB, I would say it wouldn't go down too well with organizational departments, that's for sure. Next area for us is the area of broad criticism. So what we've seen up top, fixed, even flexible, incremental, ZBB, etc. Clearly, either way, we're talking about quite a lot of time, maybe apart from incremental, okay? Next key point is, and again, I've mentioned this a few times, the business landscape, the modern business environment has changed. These techniques, or at least some of them, have been around for over 100 years. So one could say, when we say out of kilter, probably out of date, out of line, not aligned with the modern business environment. One aspect is technology, but there are many, many other aspects. Business is done in a completely different way as of now. Costs are incurred in completely different ways now. The third key point is gaming, and for this, I think gaming can mean a lot of things in business, but in essence, what we're talking about here is the idea of broadly dysfunctional behavior. What we're saying is that traditional budgeting can lead, or can be more likely to lead, to dysfunctional behavior on the path of people involved in those budgets, whether or not they're involved in the actual preparation, like a manager, or indeed staff linked to a particular department that has a budget. The degree of gaming, could be higher, just simply based on the key tenets of these areas of budgeting. Now, given that, and given all of that, here we come to, again, an important area, beyond budgeting. Now, what we mean by this is, here is maybe a solution to the problems that we've outlined in relation to traditional budgeting. Guiding principles to enable an organization to manage its performance and decentralize the decision-making progress without the need for traditional budgets. That's quite a mouthful. Essentially, what we mean is, and the proponents of beyond budgeting would suggest, is that really traditional budgeting is dead. What we need to do is to think of a different way to manage future costs, and indeed to manage our performance against our anticipated costs. Another key definition here is a stretch goal. Okay, so really what we're talking about there is really a goal that is difficult to achieve and really requires an organization, or indeed a person, to push themselves. So in essence and in summary, I guess we're talking about a new system. So how would we go about this in terms of a set of action steps? Let's just say that you're an organization, or you're an FD or a CFO, and you want to introduce beyond budgeting. What do you do? Well, first things first, forget financial targets, and indeed replace them excuse me, replace them and plan using sketch goals that are not linked to reward schemes. Okay, and indeed, outside of that, point number 2, appraise managers based on comparisons with peers, with their own peers, and benchmarks, and reward them accordingly. Take away responsibility for planning from the center and take it towards where the action is. In other words, the shop floor, the people involved in incurring those future costs. Outside of that, number 4, manage resources. Be careful with your resources and have resources available for worthwhile opportunities. In other words, keep your eyes open and manage your resources carefully. Linked into that, use rolling forecasts, performance league tables and other KPIs to measure and control performance, rather than just relying on your straightforward, okay, that's the budgeted amount, this is actual. So really what you're talking about is being sort of more proactive rather than reactive, keeping your eyes open, monitoring the environment, monitoring changes in the environment, getting people on the shop floor and people close to the action involved, and thinking in a completely different way than your traditional, okay, budget v actual, investigate variance. Next area for us is forecasting. Now, we mentioned up top about the vagaries of budgeting and the problems associated with forecasting forward. Let's look at a couple of techniques that may assist. You may be familiar with these from your past studies. Linear regression, pretty straightforward, really talking about 2 variables, generally speaking. And we're talking about a technique to estimate the relationship, perhaps in relation to, let's say, a variable production cost. One variable will impact another variable. Okay. Now, real detail for the SBL exam note is not required. What about time series analysis? Again, something that you will be familiar with, I'm sure. Sorry, bear with me one second. Something that you'll be familiar with from past studies and indeed in other papers. Really, we're talking about a technique using an ordered sequence of past values of a variable at equally spaced time intervals to sort of try and sort of, I guess in one sense, look at patterns, seasonal and indeed other cyclical fluctuations from long-term underlying trends. That's a bit of a mouthful. What are we trying to say? Well, we're trying to say that looking back over the sort of behavior, let's say, of particular variables and variables over the course of time, we should be able to use relationships to be able to predict forward, to forecast better, either based on seasonal or indeed other possibly cyclical areas. Okay? In terms of uses, a number of different uses, everything that a business would need to do outside of, sales, budgeting, stock market, etc., etc., etc. So a myriad of uses, all the areas that we would generally tend to need forecasting for. Okay, remember, as I said, we don't need real detail for the SBL exam if number crunching isn't your thing. Okay, so two key techniques. Let's look at standard costing. Now, we mentioned this up top that standard costing has been around for a long time, as long as sort of cost control has been around. So what do we mean by these things? Well, firstly, standard cost is a predetermined cost. It's a predetermined target cost. So I guess what it provides is a sort of a yardstick to measure actual performance. So we think, based on our work, that the standard cost of X is going to be Y. Okay, so there we have an anticipated cost going forward. So let's compare actual costs down the line after a period, after a month, to that cost. Variance is obviously the difference between the two. And indeed, we're familiar, I guess, with the myriad of possible variances that can occur, let's say, for a manufacturing company. Okay? Next area for us is, relevance. When is standard costing relevant? When is variance analysis and the use of standard costs to compare actual, but when is it relevant? Well, generally relevant in stability or stable industries, where we have a reasonably good feel for anticipated costs. In other words, where margins can be maintained, the difference between sales and costs, and or they can be improved by cost control. So that's where this area would be relevant. What about where it would not be relevant? Well, broadly, let me go back again, my apologies, in areas that use automated manufacturing processes. So, there, as you would imagine, usage variances are going to be small. In other words, the more automation there is, the less likely that these sorts of techniques are going to be overly helpful, because things are generally more fixed than they are variable. Okay. Next area for us is, given what we've just said, and we've been fairly critical, let's summarize the sort of downsides or limitations. First off, where we have a standard, or indeed a standard cost, clearly that is something that could be very easily outdated very quickly. And if it is outdated, then clearly we're going to have issues with our budgetary control going forward if we're basing our work on a predetermined old standard cost. In addition to that, I've said a few times dysfunction. I also mentioned gaming. Traditional approaches, broadly speaking, and this doesn't mean that contemporary approaches aren't open to this, but certainly one criticism that can be leveled or limitation is manipulation. For example, the building in of slack into budgets. That's manipulation. In addition to that, when we think about standard costing and variance analysis, broadly speaking, in terms of a variance analysis exercise, where a variance is material, it's investigated. Where it's fairly small, it's seen as insignificant, but this could be a trend. the idea of only looking at material items, that is something that's the traditional approach, but it could be hiding something. It could be hiding something. So the techniques are, to some extent, limited in their application. Okay? So there we have it then, our next area, chapter 22. A couple of things to sum up here. I think that, real detail in relation to numbers, crunching, etc., not overly important for us here. Techniques such as beyond budgeting, look for questions in that area, and indeed look back on, past SBL exam papers from September 18 onwards, and you'll see beyond budgeting as a topic area come up reasonably regularly. I'm talking about a couple of times. That's a lot over a five-year period or 6-year period. In addition to that, be familiar with the basic tenets of things like rolling budgets or fixed v flexible. Just understand what they are in a basic sense, and indeed their limitations. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for joining me.